been many times before, but it is never enough to be able to say that our lives are determined by the stories we hear and the stories that we tell. On many an occasion, the story hear and the stories that we tell are driven through print and pictures. And caregivers and caregiving have been spoken about in these stories in a certain way. And that might have been relevant and that is useful for a certain context and a certain time. Over the years, caregivers and caregiving have shifted. In them shifting, or the idea of caregiving shifting, and the fact that we are living longer, the fact that we need different types of care, the fact that now gendered roles are not so cool, we really need to recalibrate what we expect of caregivers and what we expect in caregiving. Because caregiving continues to be a familial role, it continues to be something that we think women do better than men, and so on and so forth. Caregiving in print and pictures is conversations with authors, with people that have written about caregiving and are exploring the idea of caregiving through their writing. We have found that there isn't enough writing about caregiving in India, and whatever is the writing has a certain tonality. There is a glorification of one part, but not necessarily a humanizing of all parts of caregivers and caregiving. And we would like to make an effort to do that. And through this series, we also hope that you are inspired to, start writing your own books, to start telling your own stories, and to start shifting the narrative around caregivers and caregiving. With that as the background, the topic for today is a paradigm of dealing with dementia. Last week, I was looking at a newspaper clipping that seemed to claim that there is going to be an increase of 324% of people living with dementia in our country. It's a large number, and we are a very populous country. So the number of people that will have to contend and navigate dementia is not just the person who is navigating the condition, but also their loved ones, the caregivers, and the rest of the family. It is a subject that we need to understand and appreciate, and I am delighted to have Jackie Poole with us today, who will help us work through this. A brief introduction to Caregiver Saathi. Caregiver Saathi aims to empower family caregivers by creating an ecosystem of well-being and healing for the primary caregivers, navigating terminal illness, chronic, or any other life-limiting conditions. We support them during the caregiving journey as well as after their caregiving journey. How do we do this? Through awareness programs that are webinars, humanizing our healers, looking at doctors, nurses and their stories, conversations with gentle warriors. That's our loving name for family caregivers. A helpline, healing circles, that is support groups for people during the caregiving journey and especially post-bereavement. Research, there is, we would believe that a little more to be done to understand what caregivers go through, what caregiving can be about and how that is shifting. And finally, communication through various media, social media being the dominant one. The resources that we've built so far include a tech-enabled support through our app and website, education through offline and online media, community sensitization through our podcast, which is Caregiver Diaries, Daily Mantras, and our ongoing education and communication. We have a flagship program called Caregiver Coaching and Family Counseling to support caregivers who may want to build the skills of emotional mastery and resilience, because long-term care can be quite a challenge. And finally, a volunteer base to provide emotional first aid and support the organization in multiple different aspects of our organization. There are many ways in which any one of you could be involved, whether it is conversations with gentle warriors, be a gentle warrior yourself, or be a host. Spread the word, be a volunteer with us, partner with us if you're an organization, help us reach out to hospitals, NGOs, corporates, be an ambassador, or join us as an intern or a fellow. You could join our healing groups, healing circles, or support groups, whether or not you're a caregiver today, because we need to remember you may not be a caregiver today, but you could be one tomorrow. Of course, help us raise funds, help us collaborate, join us in our research, or most significantly, be a Saathi. Jackie, just for your benefit, Saathi is the word for a companion, and all caregivers who go through the caregiving journeys can often find it a very lonely journey. So we do believe that we all need companions or Saathis. Today's session will have three broad sections. One is an interaction and a presentation, some question answers. And we urge you to give us feedback and suggestions so that we can make these more meaningful webinars and sessions that you can attend or that you might be interested in. We are very aware that these subjects are not something that are commonly found, and we would like to add to our knowledge base. Some housekeeping announcements: keep your microphone on mute at all times, prevent background sounds, and by all means, you will be invited should you raise your hand. If you are seated and your camera is stable, you could turn it on. However, if not, we request you to turn it off. We are recording this session, and some section of this discussion may be used for sharing later. The speaker section only will be live on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn, and can be viewed later. In order to help us make our webinars better, request you to answer the questionnaire that will be shared towards the end of the session. And we will refer to this discussion to make workshops and further programs that can help us navigate the world of caregivers and caregiving. An introduction to the speaker today: Jackie Poole. Jackie is an occupational therapist and has specialized in dementia for over 35 years, working in health and social care in hospitals, care homes, and people at home. That should be a wealth of knowledge and expertise. Jackie is the author of Poole Activity Level, PAL instrument, also the book From Dementia to Rementia. I'm excited to explore that with her today. She's a regular speaker at international conferences and a researcher with University of Exeter. She is a strong believer in the importance of engagement and meaningful activity to promote well-being for all. Jackie's role as a dementia care champion for QCS, or Quality Compliance Systems, and also as a visiting lecturer to postgraduate students in the University of Winchester, supports her ongoing passion for learning and sharing knowledge to those who are living with dementia. Welcome, Jackie.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
I'm delighted to be connected with you. And, one can look at the pandemic in so many ways, very often with disappointment and sometimes anger and disgust. But I do say that I also look at it with bewilderment when I find that it has given me the opportunity to connect with folks like you.
Yes, it's brought us closer together, hasn't it? It really has.
Yes, yes, indeed it has. So, Jackie, how would you like to start the conversation today, having heard about Caregiver Saathi and your work?
Yes, well, two words really came out to me from your introduction there, and I think thank you for explaining what Saathi meant. I was going to ask you that, so that and I love the whole idea of companionship. It's very important, I think, in my field as well. Of course, for all of us, but the whole idea of being able to have a deeper connection is so important, I think, when you're supporting somebody who's living with dementia. And the other word that I really liked that you've got in your introduction is about healing, because that's something I've been saying a lot for many years over here. And it actually fits really well with what we're going to talk about in terms of Rementia as well, because Rementia isn't about curing, but it is about healing.
Yes.
So
I think sometimes it takes a little effort to explain that and say that, you know, you're not going after a cure, you're looking at healing, and the two are different.
yes,
Jackie,
very much so.
Yes, tell us about your journey and tell us about what led to your book.
Okay. Ooh, how long have we got? Could be here forever just on
Take
that
your
one
time.
So I in fact I write about my journey in my book, which is if I start with that part, really the reason I wrote the book was because of the journey I'd taken over, as you've said, quite a number of years, beginning probably if we go way back, my own grandmother had dementia, although back in the 1970s that would have been, we really didn't use that word to describe dementia at all, and the care and support and the knowledge really wasn't that great at that time. And then I actually, as a career, didn't really know what I wanted to do when I was at school, as many people don't, I don't think. And, gender stereotypes back in those days, if you didn't want to be a teacher or a nurse, you weren't really, there wasn't much really kind of support given. And I actually left school without any qualifications and started working in an office doing kind of clerical work. But one of the jobs that I had, over here in the UK, we have a social security system to support people with their financial situation. And I got a job doing that. And part of that job was to go and visit older people to assess what their needs were. And it really became obvious to me right back then that there was a real imbalance of the experience that older people were getting, depending on where they were living, what was available to them. And to be honest, I spent probably quite a brief time doing the assessments and a lot of time being much more kind of a companion to people, really, looking at their photograph albums of their families. And I recognised how lonely a lot of people were and the impact that was having on their mental health. So cutting that long story short, really, I decided that I wanted to, I'd been inspired really to do something more with my own life as a piece, as a way of working. So I looked at what careers were open and thinking of something that was enabling. And I was sort of looking at things like physio and speech and language therapy, and came across occupational therapy, which I didn't know anything about until I found it in the careers library, but thought, wow, this sounds a really interesting career. And I actually got a job as an occupational therapy assistant, a non-qualified OT to begin with, which happened to be working with people with dementia. And it's the first time I'd come across what dementia, the experience of dementia was. And I realised again, I suppose it's just that sort of sense of people being quite vulnerable to the whims of others, basically, and if their knowledge was lacking, other people's knowledge was lacking, then, and my knowledge was certainly lacking, then everybody started, it seemed to me as though people were treated all as if they were the same because of the condition that they'd got. And yet clearly, as I was working very closely with people, I could see how different they were in their abilities. And it really made me think, I want to do more about this. So I then sent myself off to evening class to get all the qualifications I needed so that I could train to be a qualified occupational therapist. And when I did that in the mid-1980s, once I'd qualified, I went back into the field and worked in dementia, and I've been in it ever since. And I've been really fortunate, Bhavana. I've worked in lots of different ways, as you introduced, across the whole spectrum of the way that care is provided in this country. And so I'm now, this year I'll be 65. I think I said that to you when we met the other day. So I'm kind of at the end of my career, really, although I can't imagine not working at all. But it felt to me that what I wanted to do was put it all down and write down what I'd learned, in the hope that sharing it would be useful to others. And along the way, I've again fortunate with the support I've been given and the connections I've made. I've done a lot in research, and so had some good kind of research-backed pieces of information that I wanted to share as well.
Thank you for that, because I do think that there is a wealth of wisdom. If I were to think about it when I was younger, I used to think that, my grandmother has had so much experience. She's sitting on a wealth of wisdom that it used to be easily accessible because she was around. But how about we are able to create an artifact, that wisdom that can be passed on, that can be leveraged, that can be built on? And I do think that writing perhaps is one such way. And we are certainly grateful that you took the time and the effort to write your book. I'd like for you to share with us what was the journey. So you did come to this point and you probably had the expertise and the experience, but what was it really like to go through? It must have been an emotional journey as well, to be able to put it all together and write your book. So
yes, and what I haven't actually said yet is that also my mum had dementia, obviously later on in my career. And actually, to people listening to this, I would say that, of course, what we all say is that when you've met a person with dementia, you've only met one person with dementia, because dementia affects people in so many different ways. And when it's your own family member, no matter what you know theoretically and professionally, you've got a whole other level of background history and the good and the bad of that comes into play as well. So it was a really important part of my journey, actually. It wasn't all bad. My mum and I had some great times together while she was living with her dementia. And in some ways it brought us closer together than we'd ever been. So when I was writing the book, of course, I'd got a whole load of people in my head, my mum, my gran, all the different patients and clients that I've met along the way. It was as if all their voices were in my head wanting to get into this book, and I used them as some of the examples to illustrate really that it's okay to have the theory and the knowledge and, understanding how the brain works and what can go wrong and what we can do to keep the brain at the optimum is really important. But I think to ground that in real life stories helps people to, for me anyway, it does for me, it helps you to kind of get a sense of what you can take from that to do for yourself, which I think is really important, so that it doesn't just become another academic piece.
Absolutely. I think there is a journey that one has to travel from the concept to the practice and the experience. What would you like to tell us about navigating your book and about your book? So to share.
All right then. So, well, just to show you, this is it. I've got one. Here's one I made earlier. Yes. And so it begins really with, it's in a very conversational style, because that's you know, the style I tend to write in. I'm not I don't use lots of big words if they're not necessary. I don't believe in that. And it begins really by explaining the journey and trying to weave together the personal journey with my family, but also my personal professional journey, if you like, with the main influences on my thinking and my understanding of dementia. And of course the research that I've been involved in. So then I started sort of from about halfway through the book, really. The first part of the book, I suppose you could divide it into three sections. The first part is the personal history. And then I spent some time looking at three main areas that it's not just coming from me, we know now so much more, that are really important for good brain health. So I look at nutrition and what you eat and drink, and why people have difficulties when they've already got dementia, and how that has an impact on brain health. I also look at emotion, and you use the word resilience, which I think is a fabulous word, but emotional resilience, emotional intelligence, emotional tranquility are all really important aspects of good brain health too. And there's so many kind of on the fringe of both nutrition and emotion, other areas that sort of interplay as well. So, for example, nutrition isn't just about what you eat. You also need to think about oral hygiene and gum health. We know gum disease has an impact on the brain. With emotion, we know that sleep is so important. So I cover sleep in that emotional section as well. And then the third part looks at cognition. And I suppose that's really my professional experience, is all about really understanding what happens in the brain cognitively with these different conditions that cause dementia, and the rehabilitation type approach to this idea of rementia. And then the last part really brings that all together and offers people ideas for putting together some self-help kind of plans about how they might address some of those needs.
Very nice. You know, as you were speaking, I was thinking about the range of your experience. And I wonder how it is different to be a daughter to someone who has dementia versus being an occupational therapist and a professional who visits. What is the difference between the two?
Well, huge, really. First of all, because I think, well, I suppose when as we know, we all have so many different roles in our lives, and our roles, we tend often to keep quite separate, don't we? And they're often triggered. The character and the personality, this aspect of the personality that we bring out in ourselves, is triggered by the situation that we're in. So we tend to keep, for example, work and home life very separate. And how we act at work might be very different to how we are at home, and vice versa. So when those two worlds collide at the same time, it can cause some difficulties, I think. So on the one hand, it was very helpful to have some knowledge and to be able to steer through all of the kind of the red tape and the bureaucracy of trying to get some support for mum, knowing and understanding the financial systems in the way that our welfare state works here in the UK was particularly important. However, on the other hand, knowing that made it quite difficult, because it was very frustrating knowing what should happen and what wasn't necessarily actually happening. On top of that, of course, knowing what would really help mum, but at the same time, mum saying, well, actually, no, I don't want to do that. So, whereas I would expect a patient of mine to kind of go along with, because they would respect my professionalism and my professional knowledge. Your own mum doesn't do that. So yeah, so it's I think it's a tricky balancing act, actually. And I've always said you know, and again, talking about resilience for family caregivers, you know, it's all very well as a professional person, you're going into that situation for maybe at most an hour, whereas a family caregiver, it could be 24 hours. And so it's tiring, and people need to be really kind to themselves, and you know, as we say here, cut themselves some slack. Don't feel like you've got to be doing things right all the time and that it's going to be perfect. But at the same time, I think, you know, to get help where you can get help is really important.
I like the fact that you said that. I think on many an occasion, especially women are considered to be the carers and the nurturers. And it is as if they don't need any respite. It is as if they don't need any replenishment, and that, you know, they could be on 24/7.
Yeah. And, you know, when, you know, when somebody is living with dementia and they've got these different, and it depends on which area of the brain, what kind of cognitive symptoms they're going to have. But it means that it's exhausting for them because they're trying to work things out. They're trying to make sense of things. They're trying to operate the best they can in the situation that they're finding themselves in. But the family caregiver, or any other caregiver for that matter, who's what they're trying to do, if they're doing it, being giving the care as well as they can be, they're going to be in the moment with that person. Now, most of us during our everyday lives, we're not always in the moment. We go into a state of flow where we're just simply doing what we've always done in the way we've always done it. So we call that procedural memory, actually, the process, while you're in the process of doing things. And so you're not doing a lot, making your brain work that hard at all. And even when you're doing that, your brain is using 20% of your body's energy. So when you're in a situation where you really have to be on your toes in the moment with the person, trying to work out what's happening, you're using a lot more energy. Your brain's using a lot more energy. So you're going to be more tired. And of course, the more tired we are, the more we find it difficult to be emotionally resilient. So it's really important to take those little breaks and to not think that your person who's living with dementia has to be entertained by you or engaged by you all the time. They need a break and rest, downtime, and so do you.
That's a great point, because very often I also think that there's a little power play between the person who is the carer and the one who seems to have some life limitation. Very often the carer can want to become overprotective and want to decide and do everything.
Yes. Yeah. And I think there's lots of different, and power might be one of those, you're quite right, but there's lots of reasons for that. Over the years, I've seen where family members are desperate for their person to be as they always were, if that's the correct way of putting it. So they don't acknowledge the difficulties that the person's got because they don't want to see those. There'll be other people who take over and do everything because they think they're being kind, or it could be because of the power thing, or because it's just quicker. Can be another reason if they're so kind of overlaid with lots of other things to do. And then there will be other people who become almost like a pseudo therapist, a terrorist almost, where they try to get the person to do too much and put too much pressure on the person. So there can be lots of nuances around supporting people. And I think the best thing is to, I mentioned earlier on about emotional intelligence, it's always to, rather than be too hung up and worried about getting the person to do something in the right way or to remember things, is to just take a step back and observe the person, use your emotional intelligence to look at what the person is feeling rather than what they're thinking and meaning. And then you're more likely then to relate to the person in a kinder way once you have really recognized what that emotional state is.
I'm going to ask you to repeat that and say that in a way that we can all understand that better, because I think that we spend a lot of time and energy building our thinking muscles. And I think we spend adequate energy building our intuition and our emotional, fine-tuning our emotional antennas, so to speak.
Yes. Yes. So I called it, yes, emotional intelligence. So this ability we all have to observe another person and look at their body language, their facial expressions, but also their non-verbal language, so their tone of voice, the pitch of their voice is another thing. All of those tell us what the person is feeling. And you don't need to go on a course to know that. It's innate human ability to read emotion in another person. But we've got to allow ourselves time to do that. And if we're so busy doing the thinking, what does he mean? What is he trying to do? We're not allowing ourselves that moment to step back. Sometimes we call it centering, don't we? Where you just take a breath, step back, and just observe and allow yourself to take in all those behaviors that the other person is offering you as messages of what they're feeling. And once you do that, that connection becomes so much deeper. And then you're more likely to be able to support the person and be less worried about getting them to do something or remember something. And much more important becomes that connection between you and that feeling of support.
That's fantastic, because I do think that sometimes we are in a hurry to state our position, to give a response, and unable to pick up signs or observe closely. So I like how you have broken it down, that connecting emotionally is about being vigilant and observant. I think that's very useful. You wanted to share something and your slides, so please.
Yes, let's take a look at those. Let me just share my screen, and here we go. So hopefully you can see that now. You see that now? Yes, there we go. So you'll see I've called it enabling people with dementia to live well for longer. So this isn't saying that people will necessarily live for longer, but the quality of life can be so much better, I suppose. And this isn't really, these aren't slides about what dementia is and isn't. There's lots of information out there about that. But just to say, to make sense of the title of the book, really, that here what we're saying is that dementia is not the diagnosis. The diagnoses are things like Alzheimer's disease, blood vessel disease, so vascular disease, in other words, Lewy body disease are some of the three main ones. And they cause these damages to different brain cells, depending on which condition it is. Then underneath that, you're then going to have, depending on which brain cells are damaged, you're going to have different types of cognitive impairment. So if the area of the brain, which is kind of around the temples and the front part of the brain here, is injured, then it's likely there might be some issues with speech and language. If a little bit further back is damaged, then you're likely to have difficulty storing new memories, which is learning, essentially. If you, so you can see all down the left-hand side of that spoke of the umbrella, the cognitive impairments. On the right-hand side, what you're looking at are the difficulties in doing things. So the disability that people have because of these cognitive impairments. But the whole thing is all showing here in this graphic of an umbrella, because what we say is that dementia is the umbrella term, if you like. It encompasses everything for the symptoms and the impairments that people have caused by these neurological conditions. So if we, and I think this is so important as a starting point. So we're not saying, so clearly somebody could have Alzheimer's disease, and we need to know that to get them the right meds to understand the likely progression of the condition. Very different medication if it's somebody with vascular disease, for example. So that's why it's important. But what's also important is understanding that what we're saying is if dementia is the group name for the symptoms, then rementia is the reduction of the symptoms. So that's why I was saying earlier on, it's not curing the condition, it's improving, helping the person to improve in their function. And you'll see here a quote from somebody called Tom Kitwood. Professor Tom Kitwood was worked at one of the universities that I was involved in, and I worked very closely with him back in the mid-1990s. And even back there, you'll see from this little quote that we were using this word rementia, and it's only really starting to come to the fore now. And I suppose I'm pushing that with, particularly with the title of the book. So I mentioned earlier on, Bhavana, that I look at three kind of clear areas around supporting this idea of rementia with these personal rehabilitation strategies. And so I won't go into masses of information about them, but just to say, as you can see here on this slide about nutrition, you know, obviously what we eat affects our brain. Over here in the UK, our Alzheimer's Society says, this has a little saying, it says, if it's good for the heart, it's good for the head. And of course it is, because, you know, we don't just sort of stop at the neck, it's the whole body system, isn't it? So our lifestyle is really important for our body health. And of course, that means our brain health. And we know that inflammatory foods that are likely to cause inflammation can have a negative impact. Because there seems to be a very strong connection between inflammatory responses in the body, inflammatory responses in the brain, and particularly the likes of Alzheimer's disease. And the plaques, the pathology of Alzheimer's disease is seemingly closely related to an inflammatory response. So, not saying it's only caused by food, but we could help our brain to be more healthy by having the anti-inflammatory, antioxidant type food. So there's the food, all the ones we know that are good for us, the fruit and veg, the vibrant coloured fruits, particularly. We know that processed foods are poor for us, that certain toxins are not going to be helpful to us, but also we need to think about hydration as well. And it's so important to get plenty of liquids into us to help our brain to function. Also, I do talk in the book as well about the likes of gluten and the way that, you know, if you're already got some difficulties with gluten, if it's causing that stomach problems, then it's likely also to be travelling to the brain, crossing that blood-brain barrier and possibly having some inflammatory impact on the brain. And sugar as well. And we know there's a strong link between diabetes, for example, and Alzheimer's disease. So all that stuff about keeping the body healthy through good nutrition and drinking well is really important. But on top of that, the middle bit of this is looking at functional difficulty. And we know that, of course, that if people have got cognitive impairments that are affecting, as it says on here, posture. So if somebody's not sitting well, they're not going to be able to swallow and digest their food well. If they've got poor oral hygiene, not only is it going to be an issue for gingivitis, the gum disease, that is an inflammation that seems to have a link to poor brain health. But we know, of course, if you've got poor oral hygiene and you've got tooth decay and gum disease, then you're less likely to want to chew because it's going to be painful. On a more kind of functional level, if you've got difficulties with reaching out and holding cutlery and pieces of food, it says here about vision, but it could also be actual physical vision. But when we look at the cognitive difficulty, it can also be a difficulty with recognizing what you see, which is perception. So there is cognitive difficulty, functional difficulty, and lifestyle impacts that all can be addressed when we think about even what we eat and drink. So helping somebody to sit well, making sure that they've got their dentures in if they're wearing dentures, helping them to have good oral hygiene, supporting them with the cutlery that they can hold, or finger foods if that's what they're better with, if their dexterity is poor, making sure visually that food is easy to see against the plate, and the plate easy to see against the table, helps both with perception and vision. helping people to raise food to their mouth by perhaps using what we call, I'm raising my hands here so you can see, but what we call the hand under hand technique, so that what you're doing is helping the person to raise their own arm, and actually what you're doing is triggering the muscle memory in the joints of the arm and the shoulder to help them to start, and then they're more likely to keep going with the act of dining. I've talked about emotion, and here I've just split it into thinking about the strong negative emotions of fear, anger, frustration, particularly, and often they will come from negative interactions from others. And if we recognize that, then we start to think about how can I help this to be a much more enabling emotional experience. Talked about lack of sleep and bodily tension. It's really important to recognize that how that can also have a negative impact on our stress-related responses. And so helping people to use relaxation, relaxing music, hand massage, making sure they get their good 8 hours sleep. Sleep is so interesting in the field of dementia care. We know that when people get into that, we have what we call a circadian rhythm of being awake and being asleep. And in our sleep cycle, we have deep sleep. And it's only really when we're into the deep sleep that our brain and the rest of the body, for that matter, goes through its healing process. And so when we're in deep sleep, the brain is triggered to do a kind of cleansing. And it's that cleansing that is really important to get rid of the toxins and some of those inflammatory responses. So it's really important to help people to have good sleep, good quality sleep. It's not just the length of time. And of course, again, there are cognitive difficulties that can get in the way of helping people to have a good emotional experience. And I've just popped some of these here for you. So if you've got difficulty initiating, that means kind of getting started and making the first move. And so a lot of potential for good emotional experience comes from the connection with another person. And if you've not got the ability to reach out and make that connection with another person, it's really important that that other person makes the first move. And that's what really I'm saying here with this. Social judgment can be an issue. My mum had difficulties with this. So all the rules, and they're different in different cultures across the world and even within own families. We'd make judgments about based on the rules about how we act, and we learn that, and that's stored here at the front part of the brain, which is the part of the brain that mum had some damage in. So that meant that her social rules went out of the window, and so she would go up to complete strangers and make quite personal remarks to them, try and touch them, and our role then is to support that person without kind of telling them off or making them feel that they've done the wrong thing or that they're in the wrong. So it's quite a tricky thing to do, but it's possible through warmth, I would say, and smiling, and sometimes making light of something, or just helping the person to move on might be the other way. And of course, if you've got difficulty with your memory, and we could talk for ages about memory, there's different types of memory. There's procedural memory, which is when you've learned a skill and you've stored it in your joints and muscles. People talk a lot about short-term memory, but short-term memory is just where you're holding information long enough to use it. And when it comes to communication, that short-term memory is often used, as I'm using it in this moment actually, to hold on to the topic while you're talking about it. So short-term memory difficulties get in the way of doing that, and so people can lose the thread of what they're saying, particularly if there's lots of distractions around. So it's very helpful to people who've got that difficulty if you minimize the distractions, have a quiet place to have a conversation, turn off the television or the radio, even draw the curtains if there's a lot of street busyness going on outside, so that people aren't distracted. People might have difficulty with word finding, what's called their lexical memory, and struggle with that, and you have that sort of sense of it's on the tip of my tongue but I can't remember what the word is, and then people start to get anxious because of that and feel foolish, and before you know what's happened, they've stopped socializing because they're worried about looking silly in front of others. So helping people with their naming and their word finding can be really important as well. And then the final one, I'll stop after this one, Bhavana, and come back to you. But the final one of these is about cognition. And I've already talked about some of these different types of memory here on the left. And of course, then we've got all these different types of cognitive abilities that can be damaged. But don't forget that they're not all damaged. And it's really important, I think, for somebody with dementia to understand and recognise what they can do as well as what they can't do. Otherwise, we'll always disable people. It's really important to see, well, yes, okay, so they've got a problem with this, but they can still do this, and think about how to present the world to the person through the abilities that they have got. And being able to use a stimulating and rehabilitation focused approach, which is what the final part of the book looks at, really, helping people to focus on relearning a lost skill or relearning a lost piece of information, such as what are the grandchildren's names, helping them to repeat over and over the practice of doing that. What we know is it's possible, and I've been involved in several major research programs now where we've evidenced this, through repetitive practice and through particular techniques of helping the person to hold that information and expand the time between the first time of recalling it and then having another practice a bit later. It's possible to help. What we think is happening is that new brain networks are being laid down in place of the damaged ones, so the person is able to relearn something new or something that they'd previously lost. So I am going to perhaps come back to this slideshow, but I'll come off it for a moment to see how we're doing. But I could talk to you a little bit more about the PAL. But has anybody got any questions or thoughts about what I've said so far?
Anyone who has any questions, you could raise your hand and let us know. Questions so far? We have some people here who work extensively with people with dementia. They might be quite experts themselves. Good to see you here, Vidya.
It doesn't have to be a question. It can be a comment or something that they can share.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Bhavana. It's very interesting, this presentation, Jackie. Excellent. I'm kind of going down memory lane myself, working with family with dementia. And I quite agree to what you're saying with your personal experience. And it's wonderful that you're sharing all this with each of us, you know. So
Thank you.
It reiterates and wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm thinking that maybe we should, we do want to have a more intense and in-depth learning opportunities. And we will think of ways in which we can engage with Jackie so that not just we use the book, but we are able to leverage the experience and expertise that she has. There is a lot that is said about stages of dementia. Is there some way to measure this?
Oh, what a perfect question to ask. Yes. And people talk about, they have different names for these stages, of course, and they talk about early, middle, late, or early, moderate, advanced are often the ways of talking about it. I developed the PAL instrument, which in a minute I'll share my slides again and just quickly show you it. And really leading on from what I was just saying before I came out of the presentation, it actually looks more at what the person can do as it does what the person can't do. So it's the PAL stands for pool activity levels, pool being my surname, and it's ability that is being identified as much as difficulty. So shall I share my screen again? Is that all right, Bhavana, if I do that?
Yes, please.
Okay, let's have a quick look at this then. Okay, you seeing that again now?
Yes.
Right, good. Okay, so I think the reason I developed this was, well, there's a long story behind it, which I won't go into now, but really what the PAL is doing is recognizing how important it is to balance achieve this balance really between, for any activity, whether it's personal care, from getting up in the morning to having a wash, getting dressed, living your day, really, there needs to be a balance between what the activity demands of us and what our ability is to engage in it. And that actually is physically, cognitively, socially, in all sorts of ways. And what the PAL does really is recognize just one element of this. It recognizes the cognitive ability of the person, and so that then it will help you to facilitate this just right challenge. Okay, so the PAL instrument, Bhavana mentioned that I work now with QCS. They actually acquired the PAL instrument from me last year, and I've kind of gone with it to QCS to help it to settle in. And actually, there is a book about the PAL, but you don't need to get that, because I've already mentioned this book, and the PAL is in the back of this book in its paper format. But what you're also seeing on this screen is a URL where you can get the digital version of the PAL for free, which is always a beautiful word, I think. So do take a note of that. And but I'll send you these slides afterwards as well, so that if people want, you can circulate them and share that link with them. So essentially, the PAL instrument assesses. It's two parts to it. It assesses the cognitive ability of individuals, and then it interprets that and produces a guide for how to present the world to the person at one of 4 levels. So there are 4 levels involved, and these are the descriptions I use of the levels. So the planned level is the highest level of ability, but even at this level, people have got the beginnings, so your early dementia, if you like, of that. What's likely to be that higher level thinking of problem solving, the executive functions of reasoning and planning, and so on. Then the next level is the exploratory level, which is really where people are no longer able to use those higher level functions. And so they are very much going to be engaging with their world by exploring it, and chance encounters with objects will spark their interest. And I think it can be a very creative and joyful mode of operating, as long as those who are supporting the person understands that and enables that to happen. Then we have the sensory level, where the person now really is responding to the sensations that are coming into connection with them in what we call a sensory motor way. So sensation in, movement out, essentially. And that is, of course, through the 5 senses, but then what we call proprioception as well, which is the sensation that comes from movement and that sense of where your body is in space, which is why I was saying earlier on about, the hand under hand technique, helping people to move their arm towards their mouth will trigger that memory, that sensory memory of joints and muscles in movement, which might help the person to keep going. And then the reflex level of ability, which others might call advanced dementia, I like to see what people can do. And this is where people, yes, they are kind of towards the end of their journey with dementia. They're likely to be responding, therefore, purely through their reflex zones. So we'll start off with our reflex responses, and then we learn to override those and to kind of dampen them down if we don't want to use them. So a very classic one is a young baby. When you're holding a baby in its arms, it will turn, because it feels its cheek against the chest, it will turn its head towards the source, because it's called the rooting reflex, because it's looking to feed. That same reflex then, of course, we override when we get older. But if you've lost all those abilities, by the time you get to this level, what you can do is simply stroke the person's face here at the cheek and stimulate the rooting reflex to help the person to open their mouths to accept food if you're helping them to eat. So that's just one example of recognizing the way that somebody is now operating and thinking, how can I help them to engage at this level? So very quickly, and I'm hoping this is going to work, it's the first time I've ever done this, I've embedded the link for the PAL instrument into this slide. Oh, let's hope it's going to work for us. Just looking out. Oh, here we go. And it has. So are you seeing that, Bhavana? Can you see the checklist?
You need to share that other screen, what you're sharing
Oh,
presentation.
there, right. Okay, thank you. Let's have a look at that. Is it there now?
Yes.
Oh, wow. Right.
This is how experience works, right?
Yeah, exactly. Experiential learning. So I just wanted to very briefly show you. So this is what's called the PAL checklist in its digital format. And I'll come back up to the top in a minute. But what you can see is there are actually 9 different activities. And each of those 9 activities are each described in 4 ways of describing really how a person is likely to be able to complete that activity. And what you're doing is saying, completing it on what's the best you've ever seen this person being able to do in say, the last 2 weeks. And you just click on the one that most closely describes. Now, I would say, you see here, it says need soap, put on flannel and 1 step at a time directions to wash. Now, that is I think that's probably culturally specific. And this checklist has now been translated into lots of different languages all around the world, not into Indian and the languages that you guys use yet. But it could be and that might be something we might think about working together on, Bhavana, is what I was thinking. But it's really important that this is culturally specific. And of course, I can help you to.
So that was a question, that how culturally aligned is the questionnaire. So thank you for taking that up.
Yeah.
And, let's just make a note that we'd like to work with you to adapt this to the Indian context. Yes.
Right, great. So forgive me that this is very UK specific, and I just want to very quickly, I'm not even going to, because I'm conscious of the time for you, is just go down and just click on some of these. Now, what you'll see I'm doing is that I'm not always clicking on the same column, and that's because people vary in what they're able to do, that they're more able for some activities than they are others. And that's because some activities are simpler and easier to complete. And also maybe because some activities are more meaningful to the person and they enjoy them more. So different reasons why people are more able. But what you do when you get to the bottom, it's summed it up and told you, well, in this case, this person has had 5 planned level and 4 exploratory level. So the majority is planned. So it tells you here that the overall activity level identified is planned. Now the magic happens though here, because that's kind of academic, so what? But here, where it says please click here, when you click on that and tell me, is this showing now or do I need to do another screen?
Yes, no, this is good.
Lovely. So now what you've received is a guide to supporting the person at this level of ability. And this you can save as a writable PDF. You can add in the person's details. There's a little picture of me explaining what it's all about, but this is the important part. What you've now got is lots of pages, and I'll quickly whiz down them in a moment, but they all follow the same sort of format, where at the top you're able to write in here more details about the person's preferences and routines and likes and dislikes and so on. But then it describes for you at this level, what is the person likely to be able to do and not be able to do? And then here underneath, what therefore is your role as a caregiver to support the person as this Saathi, the companion? How are you going to enable the person at this level? And what sort of support are you going to give? Where do you put objects so that the person can engage with them? How do you give your verbal direction so the person can understand them? And there's also little environmental tips for each of the areas about what will be additionally helpful. So this one was about bathing and washing. There's one about getting dressed. There's one here about dining. And I think, not feeding, but dining is really important, because if we get this right, dining is more than just getting food and drink into somebody. It's the whole social experience that's important too. And then we've got 2 more, one about engaging with other people. So relationship and communication and connection. And then the last one is about the leisure activities. And explains about how to help somebody engage with those. So that's what the PAL instrument is all about. I'm going to stop sharing again. And so really, I suppose that's another way of thinking about levels of ability beyond this idea of the medicalized stages of the progression of what's happening in the brain.
Brilliant. It is so practical, and it has, it's like a guide. It can help you plan better. It can, really be such a support for the.
Yeah, I developed it in the mid 1990s originally, with the help of Tom Kitwood, who I mentioned to you earlier on, with his support really and encouragement. And then in 2008, it was actually, without me, it was the subject of a reliability and validity study at the University College of London. So it is a standardized, reliable and valid tool. And I've mentioned it's been translated into lots of countries, and it's used in lots of different ways. It's used by family members, it's used by professional care workers, by occupational therapists to help guide their therapy programs. But those guides they can then share with others who are also supporting that person. So, if you're a family, and I get this, if you're a family member and you all have different opinions about how best to help mum, I think having a guide that's a reliable and valid tool takes that argument away, because it's there to support you all in an agreed way. So I do think that can be useful.
Without doubt. I mean, what a lovely way to manage conflict, right?
Yes. Because Jackie says.
Jackie says this. Where's Jackie? She's a few thousand miles away. Thank you. This is brilliant. And I'm going to just open the floor for, in addition to a lot of thank yous, gratitude, and that we are very impressed with what this is. And again, delighted that, we could connect and bring this to a larger number of people. So excited about that. Are there any questions? Well, I'll wait for someone to raise their hand, but I would like to ask you one question. You mentioned briefly about the loss of social etiquette or social presence, and that can trigger a bunch of emotions for the families or the caregivers. I know of a few people who feel ashamed or who would feel guilty or angry and disappointed and misunderstood. And I think that retaining your compassion in those circumstances can be quite hard. What are some of the practices that you would recommend for family members?
Yes, I think, I suppose having a plan for when those situations arise already thought through, so that, because it's very easy in the moment, and if somebody does something quite shocking, and shame is a massive emotion, isn't it, to have to deal with. In the moment, those feelings for yourself as a caregiver are quite overwhelming, and so you're not able to do clear thinking. So always to have a plan beforehand about what's the best way, and it might be about distraction, so that to help that situation not to arise in the first place. I have to say I use distraction quite a lot for my mum, and distraction, you can use what's called alerting language, which really is as simple as say things like, oh look, or oh wow, in a very enthusiastic voice. Brings the person, it makes the person go like that and look to something else, can be really helpful, and have something lovely, not just saying it for the sake of it, but there's always something to remark on, I think, in the world around us. So just to, in that moment, as a distraction, as I was saying earlier on, if people have got difficulties with their memories, it's hard for them to focus on something if there's something distracting. But you can use that to your advantage if you want to move somebody away from something that perhaps is going to be difficult. You can, of course, smooth things over, but be careful, because if you're seen by your person with dementia to be apologising for them, I think they're either going to be very hurt or very angry, because nobody likes to feel like that you needed to be apologised for. So it's quite nice to, if you can, to kind of come over as if you're collaborating with the person rather than in charge of them. So you sort of use the we language, or we didn't mean it like that kind of thing, so that you're on the person's side rather than against them, I would say, is another good tip.
Jackie, what is your experience about families using support groups? Support groups are not very popular in India, you know, sometimes when you're actively caregiving, you might just not have the mental bandwidth all the time as well. But what has been your experience? And Shivani will soon come to you for your question.
Well, support groups aren't for everybody. Of course they're not, because we're all different. But I would say if you are struggling, I would give it a go, because it's a way of realizing that you're not on your own, that actually if you've had a difficulty, there's very strong likelihood somebody else has had a similar difficulty, and it can be helpful just to share ideas and actually just to literally get something off your chest and feel better about it. I think that one of the risks can be of a support group is that that sometimes people have had a lot of negative experiences and they want to share those. And if you're new to a support group, you might be thinking, oh, goodness me, that's not happened, but that's going to happen. And it can almost feel like everybody else's experience you're going to get at some point and you might never. So that is, you know, you need to bear that in mind. But I think they're just a great way of sharing ideas, sharing knowledge, and certainly over here, you know, support groups have gone from strength to strength. The Alzheimer's Society have been very strong with those, and there are support groups not only for caregivers, but support groups for people who are living with dementia to share amongst themselves as well, their own experiences.
So thank you for that. Over to you, Shivani. Would you like to ask your question yourself?
Yes. Hello, ma'am.
Hello.
Yes.
Okay, so first of all, I'd like to thank you for such an informative session. I'm really
Can't hear you very clearly.
Yeah.
Could you be a little louder, please?
Okay. Am I audible now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So first of all, I'd like to thank you for such an informative session. I'm gaining some new insights here. And my question is, how is technology being leveraged to make daily activities and living easier for people who are dealing with dementia?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think we need another session, actually, Bhavana. In lots of ways, actually, and you know, clearly the likes of Zoom and all the other kind of web-based opportunities have played a part. Technology is used well, actually, I'm going to introduce you to somebody. Oh, here we go. So this is a technological device. This is called a hug. And this is a comforting device for people who are perhaps at the reflex or the sensory level of ability. I don't know what you think to him. He's supposed to be charming and comforting. He's got very long arms that wrap around you and feel very huggable. But what's really important about him is what's in here. He's actually got a beating heart. So when you hold him against you, he's very comforting. And the beating heart is a slow heart rate, so it helps to calm people who are quite agitated. So that's a really interesting use of technology for very direct use. The people who developed him and invented him, I've done a lot of work with, and actually we've built the PAL instrument around it to explain how to use Hug for people at different levels of ability. So also, of course, using technology just in terms of all the apps that are around. There are some great apps now for stimulating brain function, and cognitive stimulation is really important. You've got to be really careful, though. There is a difference between cognitive rehabilitation and cognitive training. So cognitive training, where you do a Sudoku a day or a crossword a day or whatever, is all very well. It's good to keep your brain active, but all that will do is get you good at Sudoku or good at crosswords. And that's training. It's not rehabilitation. What ideally, and I was just thinking this time last year, probably, I went to 2 years ago now, I went to a conference, and in the coffee area, there was a lady with her daughter, and the lady was doing a Sudoku, and her daughter and I got talking, and the lady sat next to me stopped doing a Sudoku to listen, and it turned out that the older lady had got dementia, and she was telling me she does a Sudoku a day to help her, and she was saying that she was an accountant, so numbers were her thing. Now that's going to keep that area very active, but I was saying to her, well, what would be really good would be to do lots of different activities, and said, so for example, a poem a day would be a good thing, because that's using a completely different area of the brain. And I had this wonderful experience in the middle of this busy London conference of this lady and I both reciting a very favourite childhood poem together, which was fantastic. It's one of my lasting memories, I'm sure, that I'll take when I've well and truly retired. So I suppose the message is that, yes, use the technology, but be eclectic with it. Be very broad ranging in the way that you use it, to give the brain a good workout across all areas.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, thank you, Shivani, for that question and such a great response. And we can see Vidya is supporting us with some resources that she has access to. So thank you for that, Vidya. You're absolutely right. There is such a social stigma to accessing support and help that it is really hard to somehow trigger the support groups. Dishari, your question, would you like to ask it yourself?
Yeah, it's coming from a personal struggle with my own grandmother. It used to be very difficult sometimes when when your grandmother couldn't recognize you, or there was a lot of restlessness in the sundowning, as we say. So how do we actually keep up that? I just know we used to feel very lost sometimes. So what is your advice for the caregivers?
Okay, so there were several things in there actually which were quite interesting to touch on. So I suppose the thing is that it's very hard to fight stigma, isn't it? But I suppose the way that we finally will beat that is through the likes of this avenue, and being able to well, over here in the UK, they talk about dementia activists, and so I think the more is written, the more is spoken, the less stigma becomes attached to it. So we have to be really prepared to be open and keep going, basically, to make that happen. In terms of you mentioned about sundowning there, which if people aren't familiar with that, is an interesting concept, because it's true sundowning is when, and again, it touches on what we were talking earlier on about sleep, is to do with the circadian rhythms of the body being triggered by daylight and dusk. And if that area of the brain is damaged, then the person is not starting to kind of wind down into relaxation and heading towards sleep when dusk arrives. And that's what we mean by truly by sundowning. But it isn't always that's the issue. It can be that because somebody is getting towards the end of their day and they've had perhaps a build-up of setbacks, difficulties, not being understood throughout the day. By the time it gets to that point, they've kind of had enough, and that can be why. It could be that actually there's a change in the atmosphere at that time of day, so something different is happening. Perhaps people have come home from work, or something, you've starting to do the cooking. I've just put Hook down, he's getting in my way. And so there's a change of atmosphere which is triggering a sense of something new happening, and I ought to be doing something. So I think with all these kinds of behaviours, it's really important again to take that step back and really look at what is the trigger, and then see if you can then preempt that trigger ever happening. So, for example, if it truly is sundowning and it's to do with light, then you could look at managing the light in the environment, will help. If it's more about the person is feeling quite frustrated and it's just a build-up throughout the day, then you might want to look at having little moments of occupation throughout the day. If it's more about you've realised it's happening at a particular time of the day all the time, and perhaps it is, say, for example, about the time of when you're starting to cook dinner, which is when you're starting to be busy and you could do without this interruption, perhaps what you need to be doing is helping your grandmother or your mother or whoever it is to have a sense of role in that kitchen activity. So help them to sit at the table with you, provide them with something to do that they can do so that they feel like they're contributing. So you almost preempt that behaviour happening in the first place. But you need to know what the triggers are first before you can begin to do that. So you almost have to, we talk in this country sometimes about being a dementia detective. You have to kind of spend your time detecting what it is that's causing the difficulty in the first place. And you won't always get it right. What works one day might not work the next. That's the other thing to say. Right.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
One other part that Dishari mentioned was, there is generally a sense of loss and sorrow when the person is there but not there, and not really, that relationship is not there. And I think that has a profound effect on the caregivers.
Absolutely. And of course it does. But I think we don't hear it so much now here, but there was an awful lot of talk back in the, a few years back, many years back probably now, about people, the living death and people it not being their mother anymore. Well, they are, of course they are, but they might not be expressing it in the same way. And I think two things I would say: recognize what people can do and celebrate the little moments that you do have, I think is really important. And the other thing is to use, I don't know if you do this already, but use life history type of approaches. So have photograph albums or life history, life story boxes of objects that are meaningful to the person, or photographs, and use those as a kind of this is your life kind of approach to sitting with the person and celebrating the things that they've done in the past is a really powerful way of helping to keep that connection as well. And to begin with, so for example, if people are at the PAL level of planned, you could probably help the person to recall what's in those photographs and recall how they used those objects. But as the person progresses with their condition, that would be too much pressure to do that. So you need to know what that history is. And it's really helpful to start early, get these history books put together and labelled, so that as the condition progresses, instead of you helping the person to recall it, you're going to give the person their history, and you're going to say, look, this is you with daddy, this is you with his first car, whatever it is, so you give the history, but it's a fabulous way of hanging on to that that sense of relationship.
So many ideas there and so much insight, so much wisdom. We could go on and on. Thank you, Jackie. We really appreciate the generosity with which you are here today. Not just for this session, but also the generosity with which you have put together your book and a PAL and made it available through QCS. Thank you for, thank you. Thank you for everything.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I've just, it's an honour. It really is. I feel really privileged to be able to talk to you all. I keep thinking, oh, I'd love to be over there. So, who knows?
I really hope that there will be opportunities and, you know, the world will change and you can visit us and we can find other ways to meet. Yeah. And there are many who joined in today, and there are many who will watch this program on our platforms, as well as we hope to be able to continue this work. So I'd like to thank you again. Thank you, Vidya. Thank you, everyone who's been here. Pranada, I recognize some names and faces. Those are new ones. That's wonderful. Have a lovely evening. Grateful that you spent your Friday evening with us, Friday afternoon for Jackie. Have a lovely weekend. Lots of love and light to each one of you.
Thank you. Thanks, Bhavana. Lovely to see you again. Bye, everybody. Thank you.